I mentioned yesterday the Supreme Court was about to rule on a number of critical issues. One that really caught my attention, and thank goodness the court ruled this way, even though it's going to turn out, I think, to be kind of a Pyrrhic victory. But the Supreme Court ruled yesterday against Republicans, Christian fascists in North Carolina, who were fighting for a congressional district map that would heavily favor their candidates. It was a 6-3 ruling by the Supreme Court justices, and the vote said that the North Carolina Supreme Court, and I must make notice, not the one that's in session, not the one that was elected into the current configuration of the North Carolina Supreme Court, but the one before that. That's where the Pyrrhic part of this victory comes in. I'll get to that in a minute. But in a 6-3 vote, the Supremes ruled that the North Carolina Supreme Court was acting within its authority in concluding that the map put together by Republicans in North Carolina constituted a partisan gerrymander under the North Carolina state constitution and was therefore not allowed, right? Now, in ruling that way, the Supreme Court declined to embrace what the Christian fascists were hoping for desperately. And that would have been a broad version of a, up to this point, obscure legal argument called the independent state legislature theory. Now, the Christian fascists say that argument, the independent state legislature theory, limits, the Republicans say this, limits the authority of state courts, like the North Carolina Supreme Court, to strike down certain election laws enacted by state legislatures. This weird little theory called the independent state legislature theory holds that, if you interpret it the way the Christian fascists do, that state legislatures, say, for example, the North Carolina Christian fascist-controlled state legislature, had the power to decide the election laws, and the Supreme Court in North Carolina, for example, couldn't say, wait, you're in violation of the state constitution. Supporters of the Orange Nazi cited this theory, the independent state legislature theory, in various cases during the 2020 presidential election, and all those court cases that the bastard Trump tried to use to overturn the legitimate end of the 2020 election. The son of a bitch will stop at nothing. Well, that's the true nature of fascists. They will not stop at anything. Even after they take control of a government, the fascists don't stop. Then they continue to, you might say, tighten the screw of authoritarianism. This is what Trump is about. Now, the 6-3 ruling by the court was obviously welcomed by voting rights groups and Democrats who were rightly concerned that a ruling the other way, if the court would have ruled, okay, the independent state legislature theory is a good one. Okay, if they would have ruled that way, that would have curbed the power of state courts to declare unconstitutional certain attempts by the Christian fascists to bypass the people who vote, no matter who wins. The legislature could say, nah, you didn't win. You won. And that power would have been readily available to the Christian fascists in the elections coming up in 2024 and beyond. Former President Barack Obama weighed in on this. He tweeted this, quote, "Today the Supreme Court rejected the fringe independent state legislature theory that threatened to upend our democracy and dismantle our system of checks and balances," end quote. Now, that is not hyperbole. That is exactly what the fascist Christians are aiming toward. That federal law means nothing within the borders of a state. The state can decide itself. In other words, its Christian fascist legislatures can decide what will pass for the results of a vote, or how a state is gerrymandered, you might say. Now, to be honest, Democrats have done the gerrymandering thing too. Hopefully this will put an end maybe to that also. But I haven't gotten to the Pyrrhic part of the victory yet, right? Now, the independent state legislature bullshit argument hinges on language in the Constitution, in the election clause of the Constitution, that I knew nothing about until I did a little quick research. And that says, election rules, quote, shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, end quote. Hidden in the Constitution. But the Christian fascists have gone over every semicolon, every comma, every quotation, trying to find a way to use our system to destroy our system. It's that simple. Now, supporters of this bullshit, and by the way, it's never been endorsed by the Supreme Court. I think it's been tried before, but supporters of this theory say that the language in the Constitution supports the idea that when it comes to federal election rules, state legislatures have ultimate power under state law, potentially regardless of potential constraints imposed by their own state constitutions. That the legislatures within these red-controlled states, these Christian fascist-controlled states, those state legislatures can declare anything to be legit where it concerns electing representatives or senators that they decide is legit. Well, maybe not senators. Now, the majority opinion, that 6-3 opinion, was written by John Roberts, the quiet man, the Chief Justice. And in his majority opinion, according to what I have here, he wrote this, quote, state courts retain the authority to apply state constitutional restraints when legislatures act on the power conferred on them by the election clause. So in other words, what he was saying there is that, okay, you do have certain rights under the election clause, you really do, to enact certain laws, and the Constitution says that your election rules and laws shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But that doesn't mean you can get away with murder. It's up to your court, your own court, Supreme Court, to determine whether or not you passed a law that's unconstitutional as per your own state constitution. And he added, though, that the state courts, like the North Carolina Supreme Court, does not have what he called free rein when there are conflicts with federal law. In those situations, federal courts can intervene. That's kind of the bottom line of what the Supreme Court decision was. Roberts added this, quote, in interpreting state law in this area, state courts may not so exceed the bounds of ordinary judicial review as to unconstitutionally intrude upon the role specifically reserved to state legislatures. So state legislatures have the power to make certain decisions about how the voting is going to be conducted and in what division among the different districts within the state. But the courts have the power to determine whether or not it's unconstitutional. Blah, blah, blah. Now, when this challenge arose in North Carolina, the Supreme Court was controlled by Democrats. And the Democratic-controlled state Supreme Court in North Carolina issued the ruling last year. And that ruling simply said, hey, look, the state of North Carolina has been gerrymandered to a point where it's ridiculous. You're trying to eliminate Democratic votes for all intents and purposes. Well, guess what? The court flipped. The state Supreme Court in North Carolina flipped to Christian fascist control following November's midterm elections. And that Supreme Court recently overturned the previous Supreme Court's decision, a move that prompted questions about whether the justices, even the Supreme Court justices, even decided or even needed to decide the case. This is why it's a Pyrrhic victory, because what the current configuration of the North Carolina Supreme Court did was just overturn the ruling made by the Democratic-controlled Supreme Court. So now the state of North Carolina is right back to where it began. Not so much that the legislatures can determine how an election outcome is going to be determined, other than through the vote, but that the state legislatures can go ahead and gerrymander the shit out of the state of North Carolina, as it was originally done before the Democratic-controlled Supreme Court took over. Now, why the citizens of North Carolina would throw out Democratic Supreme Court justices and install Christian fascist Supreme Court justices is beyond me. I can't understand that. No more than I could understand 80 million people voting for a second time for Donald Trump. I am totally lost where it concerns any attempt by me to understand what is happening, why people vote for Trump, why people vote for fascism, why people vote to limit their independence, to limit their sovereignty, to limit their freedoms. And I know there's all kinds of psychological theories as to why people do that. But I can't believe that my fellow human beings who would do that sort of thing are so hell-bent on destroying their own lives. A real puzzle for somebody like me. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. You know, the Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy, 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.